$2 trillion. That's the projected trade volume flowing through a corridor announced this week that Washington didn't build, Beijing didn't finance, and Brussels had zero input on. The UAE and India just activated an economic artery that bypasses every choke point the West spent 70 years controlling. And the cargo moving through it starting next month isn't theoretical. It's real goods, real ships, real infrastructure, already operational. Here's what this means for the global order you thought was permanent. Every container moving from Mumbai to Abu Dhabi to European markets now has a route that skips the Suez Canal entirely. Gas prices, shipping costs, the leverage Western nations held over Middle Eastern oil exports, all of it just encountered a structural alternative built without asking permission from Washington or waiting for World Bank approval. The bill for constructing this network, a $100 billion split between Gulf states and India. The time it took to negotiate, 18 months of quiet diplomacy, while Western media focused elsewhere. And the country that stands to lose the most control, the United States, which just watched two of its supposed partners create an economic alliance that doesn't require dollars, doesn't route through Western financial systems, and doesn't need American approval to function. This channel runs on no corporate funding, no government backing, and no advertising pressure telling us what to leave out. The analysis that needs to happen about what the UAE-India corridor represents is not happening on mainstream platforms. It's happening here. If you want to understand every shift in the global economic order before the headlines catch up, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. This kind of breakdown, connecting infrastructure projects to actual power shifts, is what this channel does every single time. Let me show you exactly what happened. On March 14th, officials from the United Arab Emirates and India formalized the India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor, known as EMEC. This isn't a memorandum of understanding or a diplomatic handshake for the cameras. Phase 1 is already operational. The first cargo shipments departed Mundra Port in Gujarat on March 18th, 4 days after the signing. The route, Indian goods travel by ship to Jebel Ali Port in Dubai, transfer to rail networks crossing the UAE into Saudi Arabia, then continue by a combination of rail and maritime routes reaching Jordan, Israel, and terminating at Mediterranean ports with direct access to European markets. Total transit time from Mumbai to Rotterdam, 23 days. The Suez Canal route, 28 to 31 days depending on traffic. That's a full week faster, and that week translates to billions in reduced inventory costs, insurance, and fuel consumption. Here's what the official narrative is leaving out. Western nations are describing this as a trade efficiency project, a logistics optimization play that benefits everyone through faster shipping times. The operational reality shows something more consequential. This corridor creates the first major trade route in modern history that explicitly bypasses Western-controlled maritime choke points. The Suez Canal handles 12% of global trade and 30% of global container traffic. Egypt collects $8 billion annually in transit fees. That revenue stream just encountered its first structural competitor in 150 years. But the deeper shift isn't about Egypt losing canal fees. It's about control. Every ship passing through Suez moves through a waterway where Western naval forces maintain presence, where insurance is underwritten by London-based firms, where financing flows through dollar-denominated systems. The IMEC corridor operates under a different framework entirely. Indian and Emirati companies handle logistics. Regional banks provide trade financing in rupees and dirhams. Insurance policies are written by Gulf-based providers. The entire supply chain exists parallel to Western infrastructure, not dependent on it. Now let me show you the technical architecture that makes this possible, because the engineering here is not speculative. It's already built. The UAE has spent $40 billion since 2018 constructing the Etihad rail network, 200 kilometers of freight rail, connecting Abu Dhabi, Dubai, and the Saudi border. That network went fully operational in January of this year. Saudi Arabia's Land Bridge project, another $35 billion investment, connects its eastern ports on the Persian Gulf to its western ports on the Red Sea via high-capacity freight rail. The first freight trains crossed that network in February. India has upgraded Mundra Port, Nhava Sheva Port, and Kandla Port with expanded container handling capacity, totaling 15 million TEUs annually, 20-foot equivalent units. That capacity came online in December. These are not future investments. This is functioning infrastructure that was quietly assembled over 5 years, while Western analysts focused on China's Belt and Road. The system moves goods at costs that undercut traditional routing by 20 to 30%. A container shipping from Mumbai to Hamburg via Suez costs approximately $2,400 in freight and fees. The same container routed through IMEC costs $1,900 to $1,900 depending on cargo type. That $500 to $700 difference per container multiplies across the 24 million containers India exports annually. Total savings, 12 billion to 16s. 8 billion per year for Indian exporters alone. Add the UAE's re-export trade, Saudi logistics revenue, and Jordanian port fees, and you're looking at $30 billion in annual economic activity that now flows through this corridor instead of through Suez, instead of through Western logistics firms, instead of through dollar-denominated shipping contracts. Here's what they're not telling you and why the silence from Washington is louder than any official statement. The United States spent 2 years promoting its own alternative trade corridor, the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, announced at the G7 summit in June 2022. Total pledged investment, $600 billion over 5 years. Amount actually deployed as of March 2025, $18 billion. That's 3% of the commitment. Meanwhile, the IMEC corridor received $100 billion in funding, fully deployed, in 18 months. No G7 meetings, no multilateral development bank loans, no White House press conferences. Just sovereign wealth funds, national budgets, and private Gulf capital, moving faster than any Western bureaucratic process could match. The message is not subtle. Middle Eastern and South Asian nations just demonstrated they can build hemispheric infrastructure without waiting for Western institutions to approve feasibility studies. But this connects to a pattern much larger than shipping routes. What you're watching is the operational architecture of a post-Western global economy being assembled in real time. The IMEC corridor sits inside a broader network of projects that share common characteristics. They're funded outside the World Bank, they operate outside SWIFT payment systems, they're built by non-Western engineering firms, and they create economic interdependencies that don't require American participation. The UAE-India corridor links to Saudi Arabia's land bridge, which connects to Jordan's Red Sea port expansion, which ties into Israel's Mediterranean rail upgrades, which interface with European freight networks. It's a 6,000-kilometer supply chain where not a single critical node is controlled by a Western government or corporation. And that's before you add the most important piece. Now here's the math that explains this entire corridor better than any diplomatic statement or infrastructure diagram. India's annual trade with Europe, $140 billion. The UAE's re-export trade connecting Asia to Europe and Africa, $380 billion. Combined $520 billion in annual trade volume that previously moved through routes where Western nations collected fees, provided services, and maintained oversight at every stage. Suez Canal fees, $8 billion annually. Maritime insurance underwritten by Western firms, $4. $2 billion annually for the India-Europe route. Trade financing provided by dollar system banks, estimated $15 billion annual fees and interest. Logistics services from Western freight companies, $11 billion annually. Total Western revenue extraction from India-UAE-Europe trade flows, approximately $38 billion per year. The IMEC corridor is designed to capture 60 to 70% of that volume within 3 years. Do the math. That's $22 billion to $26 billion in annual revenue shifting from Western firms to regional operators. Per year, every year, compounding. But the cost asymmetry that matters most is not about corporate profits. It's about leverage. When trade routes flow through Suez, Western naval forces can close or monitor that route during geopolitical crises. We've seen this threatened during Houthi attacks in the Red Sea, during the Ever Given blockage, during periods of Middle Eastern instability. The implicit threat, conform to Western preferences or risk supply chain disruption, has been a quiet tool of influence for decades. The IMEC corridor removes that tool. Goods flowing from India to Europe via UAE and Saudi territory move through sovereign nations that are not Western allies in the traditional sense, that don't host permanent U.S. military bases along the entire route, and that have demonstrated willingness to operate independently of Washington's preferences. Turkey's recent stance on NATO expansion, Saudi Arabia's oil production decisions counter to U.S. requests, the UAE's refusal to condemn Russia at the UN, these are nations that have already shown they will prioritize their own interests over Western demands. And now they control a trade corridor that Europe depends on. Read that again slowly. The replacement asymmetry is even more stark. The United States cannot build a counter corridor. There is no alternative geography that offers faster India to Europe routing. The Suez Canal is a fixed choke point. You either use it or you go around Africa, adding 3,000 nautical miles and 2 weeks of transit time. American infrastructure investment in the Middle East has been almost entirely military: bases, weapon systems, intelligence facilities. Economic infrastructure, the ports, the rail, the logistics networks that actually move goods and generate revenue, has been left to regional powers to develop. And they just did. The West has no comparable project at a similar stage of completion. The Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment remains mostly PowerPoint presentations and feasibility studies. China's Belt and Road has infrastructure but suffers from debt trap perceptions and geopolitical resistance in India and the Gulf. The IMEC corridor exists in the narrow space where Gulf capital, Indian manufacturing capacity, and mutual strategic interest align without triggering the debt concerns that plagued Belt and Road or the bureaucratic delays that paralyze Western initiatives. Now pull back from the immediate trade logistics and look at the geopolitical chessboard this corridor sits on. China's watching this carefully and drawing very specific conclusions. Beijing spent $1 trillion on Belt and Road infrastructure connecting China to Europe via Central Asia and the Middle East. That network now has a parallel competitor that doesn't route through Chinese territory, doesn't use Chinese state-owned construction firms, and doesn't create the political dependency that made Belt and Road controversial. For China, the IMEC corridor represents both threat and opportunity. The threat, India, a strategic rival, just secured a trade advantage that enhances its economic competitiveness against Chinese manufacturing. Indian goods can now reach European markets faster and cheaper than many Chinese exports that still rely on longer maritime routes or the politically complex land routes through Central Asia and Russia. The opportunity: China can position itself as a neutral logistics provider, offering financing, technology, and connectivity between IMEC and Belt and Road networks, creating an interlocked Eurasian trade system where Chinese financial influence persists, even in corridors Beijing didn't build. Russia is watching quietly and with great interest. Every dollar of trade flowing through the IMEC corridor is a dollar of economic activity happening outside the Western sanctions architecture that has tried to isolate Moscow since 2022. The UAE and India have both refused to join Western sanctions on Russian energy. The UAE has become a major re-export hub for goods flowing into Russia despite sanctions. India is Russia's largest customer for discounted oil, paying in rupees and dirhams rather than dollars. Now, these two nations control a trade corridor that bypasses Western financial systems entirely. The strategic calculation in Moscow is straightforward. The more economic activity that occurs outside dollar-denominated, Western-controlled infrastructure, the weaker sanctions become as a tool of coercion. Russia doesn't need to be part of the IMEC corridor to benefit from its existence. It just needs that corridor to succeed, because every successful alternative to Western trade infrastructure weakens the system that is currently being used against Russian interests. But the calculation that matters most is happening in capitals across the global south. Nigeria, Indonesia, Brazil, Egypt, Turkey, nations that have spent decades dependent on Western-led institutions for trade financing, infrastructure development, and market access, are watching the IMEC corridor and asking a simple question: if India and the UAE can build hemisphere-spanning infrastructure without World Bank loans, without IMF conditions, without waiting for G7 approval, why can't we? The demonstration effect is the real power of this project. It's proof of concept that large-scale economic infrastructure can be financed, built, and operated by non-Western nations using sovereign wealth funds, national budgets, and regional capital pools. That proof is more dangerous to Western economic dominance than any single corridor's cargo capacity. And then there's the issue almost nobody in Western media is addressing directly: the dollar. Every transaction moving through the IMEC corridor can be settled in rupees, dirhams, rials, or even yuan. There is no structural requirement for dollar involvement. The UAE and India are already conducting $25 billion in annual bilateral trade using local currency settlement. Saudi Arabia has announced it will accept yuan for Chinese oil purchases. The infrastructure exists for non-dollar trade at scale. What was missing was the physical logistics network to move goods outside dollar system oversight. That network just went operational. Now watch what happens to dollar dominance when $500 billion in annual trade volume has a functional alternative to dollar-denominated shipping, insurance, and financing. The shift won't happen overnight. It will be a slow, steady migration as exporters and importers realize they can save money, avoid sanctions risk, and reduce currency conversion costs by settling in local currencies. 5 years from now, the IMEC corridor could be moving $300 billion in non-dollar trade annually. That's $300 billion in economic activity, where American financial institutions collect zero fees, where the Federal Reserve has zero visibility, and where dollar liquidity is simply not required. Here's what burned into global economic reality this week. It's not just infrastructure. It's the belief that all roads, literal and figurative, must pass through Western systems. That belief just encountered a 6,000-kilometer counterexample, built with $100 billion in non-Western capital and operational in under 2 years. The assumption that Middle Eastern and South Asian nations lack the technical capacity, the financial resources, or the political coordination to build hemisphere-spanning infrastructure without Western involvement is now demonstrably false. And once that assumption breaks, the entire logic of Western economic dominance shifts. Here are 3 predictions with a clock attached. First, within 18 months, the IMEC corridor captures 25% of India-Europe trade volume, representing $130 billion in annual throughput. Suez Canal traffic declines by 8%, and Egypt begins negotiating fee reductions to remain competitive. Second, within 3 years, at least 5 other regional trade corridors are announced using the IMEC model, sovereign wealth fund financing, bypassing multilateral institutions, operating outside dollar systems. The most likely candidates: an ASEAN corridor connecting Southeast Asia to the Middle East, a Southern African corridor linking the continent's industrial centers to Asian markets, and a Latin American corridor connecting Brazil to Asia via Pacific routes that avoid the Panama Canal. Third, within 5 years, more than $1 trillion in annual global trade moves through non-Western corridors using non-dollar settlement systems, and the United States faces a structural decline in the financial services revenue that has subsidized American economic dominance since the 1970s. Drop your prediction in the comments. Which happens first? Suez traffic decline forcing Egypt to cut fees, another major regional corridor announcement, or a measurable shift in dollar trade settlement volumes? Tell me, because I read every single one, and the discussion in the comments on this channel consistently adds perspectives that don't exist in mainstream coverage. If this gave you a framework for understanding infrastructure as geopolitical power, something you won't get from headlines about shipping efficiency, share it with one person who needs to see that the global economic order is being rewritten in real time by nations that aren't waiting for permission. The next video breaks down something even more consequential that's happening in the background of this corridor, something almost no one is connecting to the bigger pattern. Subscribe so you're there when it drops.